We are live. Hello, James.
Hi, how you doing? Feel free to call me Boz.
Boz. Okay. Hi, Boz.
Hey, good to see you.
So let's introduce ourselves. My name is Mark Leon Goldberg. I am the host of Global Dispatches, which, Boz, is the longest running independent international affairs podcast. Believe it or not, Boz, I've been publishing 2 episodes a week every week since 2013. But more recently have been doing these Substack live chats with experts around the world. And I'm happy to have you join me today. Why don't you introduce yourself for my audience?
Sure. I'm James Bosworth, also known as Boz. I've been blogging as long as 2004,
Ooh.
and,
Well,
and
so
start,
have I. But go
started writing
on.
about Latin America at that time, and sort of changed Latin America into my career. Back in 2009, I went independent. I currently run a company called Hexagon that does political risk analysis and bespoke research in Latin America. And then I write the Latin America Risk Report, which is a daily newsletter that goes out and covers both Latin America and increasingly this year, U.S. policy in Latin America, because everything this year has been U.S. policy in Latin America.
Which we'll
So that
discuss. It's funny. Our careers seem to align a little bit. I started a blog about the UN in 2004 and kind of made that into my career as well. So good to see
Yeah,
us OG bloggers are still doing our thing.
it still exists. It's amazing.
Um, so Boz, we are speaking on Tuesday, December 23rd. 2 weeks ago, Donald Trump, via social media, announced a blockade on Venezuela. And this, of course, follows repeated strikes against alleged drug boats in the Pacific and the Caribbean since September. The latest strike happening just this afternoon. And actually, as we speak right now, the Security Council is holding a special session on Venezuela. So I wanted to unpack all of this with you with the intention of having you help me and my audience and your audience understand and divine like what are ultimately Donald Trump's intentions here with Venezuela. But to kick off, I would love to have you walk me through these three seemingly very different seizures or attempted seizures of oil tankers over the last couple weeks. Just maybe go
Yeah,
through this sequentially.
yeah. So about 2 weeks ago, the United States seized a boat that has gone by a couple different names because sanctioned boats keep changing their names as part of the Dark Fleet, but is not right now called the Skipper. And in doing so, it was the U.S. Coast Guard doing a very professional law enforcement operation announced by the DHS secretary and by Kash Patel, the FBI director, not by the Department of Defense, Department of War, right? And they went and this specific boat, there was a court case. It was a sanctioned. It was a sanctioned boat, and there was a court justification that says they were allowed to seize this boat. The fact they did it in the open ocean is a new event, but hey, they actually went and went and enforced a sanction. It seemed very positive at the time.
Mhm.
Now, one of the things, just to back up for a second, is you want to know what Donald Trump's intentions are. I am very convinced that there is not a plan. They're ad hocing this. They're improvising this on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis. I can't predict exactly what's going to happen in January because Donald Trump hasn't decided yet exactly what he's going to do in January. And this is really frustrating for the Trump supporters, for the people who want to think that there's a plan, for the Maduro opponents who want to believe that there's some plan to remove the country's dictator, and for leftists who are really convinced that this is all about oil or all about Stephen Miller trying to justify deportations. Right? Everybody has like a reason why this is all happening, and there's not. They're just
Mhm.
improvising on the fly.
Yeah.
And so they got a really positive response to this oil seizure. I was very positive. I was like, wow, look at that.
Mhm.
They're enforcing sanctions and they did it all by the book with paperwork. That's great. And then this past weekend, they seized a second boat, Centuries, and there was no court order. It was not a sanctioned vessel. They initially announced it as sanctioned oil, but oil isn't sanctioned, right? You can sanction vessels, you can sanction businesses, you can put sanctions on a sector of a country. The oil itself was not sanctioned, right? So it's a complicated process by which they tried to justify this, and now they've said, well, maybe it was misflagged. No, it was correctly flagged under Panama. And then it turns out now Panama is sort of just saying, well, we actually removed our flag from some props. I mean, they're sort of legally trying to now post hoc justify what they
Hmm.
had done with this boat.
But this
Meanwhile,
boat itself, this was a Chinese vessel, properly, operating, above the board, not part of like a dark fleet trying to smuggle oil to, you know,
properly operating, I wouldn't necessarily go quite that far. It was not the dark fleet in the sense it was not a sanctioned vessel,
yeah.
right? But they were moving oil from Venezuela to somewhere. Probably going, oftentimes this oil gets moved to Malaysia, reblended, and then sent to China so that China's fingerprints aren't always on the oil being sent directly from Venezuela to China. There's some manipulation going on here. I don't want to say it was all above board
Mhm.
what this ship was doing, but the ship was not on the list of sanctioned vessels, which is
Mhm.
what justified, and nor did they have a court order, which is what justified the initial, what justified the skipper did not justify the entries. And then
Mhm.
this third one, the Bella One, um, is very much a sanctioned vessel. Very much deserves to be sanctioned, right? It's been moving oil for Iran and Venezuela for years. And it turns out that, for all the cool videos that the Trump administration posted of the Coast Guard, rappelling off helicopters and going through the ships, the first two ships, those ships had surrendered at sea. The Bella One refused to surrender, and it's moving at 10 knots eastward at the moment. And they say they're in pursuit, but I mean, we have plenty of ships that go faster than this. They clearly have caught it. So the question is, what are they going to do with it at the moment? I don't think they've thought it through. Once again, this is what happens when you sort of ad hoc and improvise as you go along. You don't exactly know how you're going to deal with it. The fact that a ship decided not to surrender.
So this dark fleet sanctioned ship is in like a low speed boat race with US naval vessels
Yeah.
at the moment.
No, nobody knows. Like nobody has like beforehand you jokingly call it the OJ case, and like the OJ
Yeah.
car chase. I think that's like this thing is moving. Clearly, the U.S. can catch it, but what do we do when we catch it? And how do we handle it, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean is a great question. Unlike the alleged drug boats, you can't bomb it. It causes a massive environmental disaster. You go bomb a giant ship full of oil. Although this ship is mostly empty from what I understand. So there's a real question about what they're going to do with this ship when they finally catch it. They can catch it. They just don't know what to like how to handle it and what the rules of engagement are, because this is the first time they've had a ship refuse to be boarded in this process. They're going to learn as they go along.
So again, this is all further evidence suggesting and supporting your thesis that they're just winging it, that the Trump administration is improvising. Um, and that Vanity Fair article earlier this week about Susan Wiles, the chief of staff, seems to also give more evidence in your favor, in which she said, that they're just like doing things until Maduro cries uncle.
Yeah, well, what was funny, they said they're going to bomb drug boats until Maduro cries uncle. And this is a logic chain that does not work. Now, I mean, alleged drug boats, I take the US military at their word that they are trying to bomb drug boats, right? These are not just fishing vessels. At the same time, these drug boats, the ones that they've hit since October, almost all of them have been in the Eastern Pacific. Venezuela isn't on the Eastern Pacific. I mean, it's a geography question, right? 80% of the cocaine coming into the United States comes via Pacific routes, not Caribbean routes. And so when they started bombing the drug boats in the Caribbean, the drugs stopped moving via maritime routes through Venezuela. They actually very successfully stopped the maritime drug routes running through the Caribbean. And now they have nothing to bomb. And so now they're bombing boats in the Eastern Pacific. That's certainly not going to make Maduro quit. And nor does Maduro make most of his money via drug trafficking, right? Most of it comes via oil or gold or extortion. So there's not really a logical chain here in terms of bomb drug boats, Maduro falls. That doesn't actually occur, right? So
Mhm.
now that they've moved on to the oil vessels, there's actually a reason to believe oil would be a better pressure point. I don't think it pushes Maduro out either, but it's a much
Yeah.
better pressure point than
Well,
drug vessels.
so that's what I wanted to ask you. If you were to presume, and we don't know this, but presume that like regime change is the kind of ultimate goal of the Trump administration here, how does, blockading or interrupting or interfering with Venezuela's oil exports advance that goal in any way?
I do believe that regime change is the goal for Marco Rubio. I don't know if it's the Trump administration's goal, but it's definitely the goal for Marco
Yeah.
Rubio. So here's the logic chain, right? Is that Maduro needs money. He needs money to feed his population. He needs money to pay off regime supporters, that the group of generals who control the guns and keep him in power. And most of Venezuela's money comes from oil. Therefore, if you block the oil, if you block sanctioned oil, he is unable to collect the money that he needs in order to pay off both the population and that small inner circle that he needs to survive. And at some point, some wealthy, probably corrupt oligarch who's making money on the current situation will decide to push Maduro out because he realizes that it's almost certainly he realizes that there's no longer a way to make a profit while Maduro's in power. Therefore, it's worth it creates a crack within the regime in which Maduro's pushed out. There's a few problems with this chain of logic, but I mean, there is a certain logic to doing this, but there's a few problems. First off, Maduro is very willing to starve his population and make them suffer.
Mhm.
So he doesn't need as much money as you think because because he would need this money to feed the population, he doesn't care if the population goes hungry. Secondly, you have to. We've seen this before. I mean, in 2019, John Bolton implemented maximum pressure, and you can keep making your pressure more maximum and more maximum. I guess. I mean, it defies a certain logic there, but we did maximum pressure. We've put all this pressure, economic pressure, on Maduro, and he didn't fall in 2019. U.S. has put economic pressure on Cuba for decades and has not pushed out the Cuban regime. Dictatorships are willing to suffer if they can remain in power. And the sanctions, it's certainly putting pressure on Maduro, but it's not necessarily the tipping point that will push him out.
Mhm. And the one kind of quizzical thing to me that again suggests there's not like a single Trump administration policy here, that there are various policies, is if Marco Rubio dedicated to regime change, and these policies are intended to, as you said, like squeeze the Maduro regime, but also, as you said, he's perfectly willing to continue to immiserate his population in order to first kind of pay off his cronies to make sure they don't do the coup against him. But that creates seemingly out migration pressure that other elements of the Trump regime, the Stephen Miller wing, are trying to reverse through their immigration crackdowns here in the United States. So I can only like imagine that the strategy that's currently being implemented might lead to more like out migration of Venezuelans, potentially to the United States.
It's possible, right? And the academic literature is sort of divided on this. There's a big fight among academics right now. Did the 2019 sanctions campaign cause additional migration or not? Because the migration in Venezuela, let's be clear, the vast majority of it was because Venezuela's dictatorship is awful, right? I mean, and most
Yeah.
of it occurred before the 2019 campaign. And so it's a tough question, but yes, you're right. I mean, it's possible that increased suffering in Venezuela increases the outbound flow of migration. But that's not what the Trump administration believes, right? They don't think that that's where the logical flow goes. In fact, Stephen Miller has been one of the top people pushing for some sort of campaign that goes against drug cartels somewhere in the Western Hemisphere. And him and Rubio have sort of lied at the moment on making it Venezuela. Miller doesn't care if it's Mexico or Colombia or Honduras or Venezuela. He's just happy to go after some sort of cartels and start justifying some of his deportation strategy. Rubio really wants it to be Venezuela. And so the two of them have aligned on this front, but it doesn't mean that they're going to remain aligned 6 months from now.
Mm-hmm. So, it seems kind of clear that the US will continue these like extrajudicial like murders on the sea of alleged drug smugglers. Depending on how this odd low speed nautical chase shakes out, might continue to try to seize oil vessels from Venezuela. I think one of the key outstanding questions among many people, particularly like in the foreign policy community, is whether or not the administration would take that next step and strike targets in Venezuela itself. Um, I don't want to ask you to like weigh the likelihood of that. I mean, although you can.
Happy to do it.
Yeah, please. Yeah, yeah. Weigh the likelihood of that, but I'm more interested in having you explain like the implications of that for Venezuela itself. But yeah, I mean, do you think that's going to happen? I have no idea.
It looks more likely than not, right, that they're going to hit something in Venezuela. But what that something is really matters, right? There are plenty of random drug cartel camps around Venezuela. The ELN or the Trinidad gangs have various camps, and you go bomb a camp in rural Venezuela, and it doesn't really impact the Maduro regime, but it lets Trump get a win. Said, hey, I said I was going to start striking targets on land, and here I've gone and done it. And by the way, Trump has said he could essentially strike targets in Colombia and Mexico as well. Like he's said he could strike in all sorts of places, not just Venezuela. Once again, showing this is a much broader issue than Venezuela, even though we're all sort of focused on Venezuela. I say the odds that he strikes something are greater than 50% at the moment, well over 50%. But it's still not clear what they're going to strike or what the logical chain is between hitting random camp in rural Venezuela and causing regime change, right? We haven't seen indications that they're going to conduct a major bombing campaign or a major military effort with the goal of ousting Maduro, right? They can strike something without making it a giant military campaign. They can do a one-off and claim victory and walk away.
You know, we started this conversation talking about how you and I have had like a long career over 20 years at this point, over 20 years at this point, in kind of covering various aspects of foreign policy, international affairs. At least for me, in the early 2000s, like my formative experience was the US invasion and occupation of Iraq, which was preceded by really, skillful, frankly malicious in my view, but skillful like propaganda campaigns to convince the American public that invading and occupying Iraq and deposing Saddam Hussein was like a great thing to do in American interests. What's so odd to me about this moment is that the Trump administration doesn't seem to be like care much about like trying to convince the American people that like going to war in Venezuela is like a good thing that's in American interest that will keep Americans safe. I mean, occasionally, he'll talk about, the scourge of fentanyl, but it's not any consistent like propaganda campaign to, not to get to like Marxist here, but like manufacture consent and like get the American people on board here, which is just
Yeah,
so odd to me.
they haven't tried to get the American people on board. They haven't tried to get Congress on board, right? If you go back to the Iraq war, right, the justification ended up being wrong and garbage, right? But I mean, there was a real, I mean, Colin Powell at the UN Security Council talking about WMD is a critical moment in the buildup to that war. Getting the authorization of military force from the U.S. Congress is this critical moment. And yeah, the Trump administration is dodging it, right? I mean, they have to be asked the questions usually to before they answer it. They're not trying to proactively win over the U.S. population, and they aren't going to Congress for the validity. And when you look at the polls, the vast majority of the U.S. population opposes military force on Venezuela. And so, once again, ad hocing it, they don't have a strategy. But if they did have a strategy that was long term, they would really want U.S. support because maybe they can probably pull off some sort of quick military operation over a weekend, like the Iran bombing, and be done with it. And then everyone's like, hey, we did something great. The U.S. public would move on. But if you're going to spend months and months doing this, and the U.S. population is opposed to this, and we have a midterm coming up in November, and you aren't building the case for it, like it's politically very damaging for it. And we're seeing the criticisms coming not just from the Democrats, but from a wing of the MAGA Republicans who are opposed to U.S. foreign interventions. And so, like, it is odd that they aren't trying to build the case for this.
I'm curious to get your sense of how Maduro has responded to all this. I mean, he has agency here. As we speak, the Security Council is gathering at Venezuela's request for an emergency briefing on all of this, seemingly an attempt by the Venezuelan government to curry international support in the face of like, U.S. aggression. But like, how like what have been some key elements of Maduro's response over the last, 6 weeks or so since these bombing campaigns started? And what do you expect from him going forward?
There's sort of a mixture of paranoia and confusion and arrogance all mixed together coming from Maduro, right? And he's an awful person. If I could snap my fingers and get rid of him, it would happen, right? I mean, he really is a terrible dictator who has, tortured and killed and imprisoned population and stole the last two elections. I mean, there's a lot of bad things to say about Maduro. And one of the key actors that has verified all this is the independent UN commission that has been publishing reports on the human rights situation in Venezuela for years. And they're the ones who have documented the torture and the killings and the problems with Venezuela's sort of declining democracy and now dictatorship over time. And so Maduro sort of like wants to push those criticisms aside. He wants to show that he's legitimate. He is paranoid, right? He's worried that the U.S. military and Trump could decide next week to do this, right? Drops a bomb on his head, right? So he's moving from place to place, and he's very nervous that that sort of operation could unfold because Trump seems unpredictable to him, and he's very right in that sense. And so, he's worried in that sense. But at the same time, as he's watched this build up and then nothing happen, I think he's realized that he actually, that he may survive this and it may actually turn out to be a big public opinion win for him, showing that he was able to stand up to the US and prevent, and avoid a war. And so, he's sort of going back and forth between this paranoia and this hubris. Meanwhile, I mean, he's not popular. 80% of the Venezuelan population wants change. Well, about 70% of people during the last election voted to remove Maduro, and he just held on to power despite losing that last election. So, I mean, the Venezuelan population wants change. He's under pressure domestically. Do not doubt that. But he has sort of calmed down at the moment. He's watching what the US is doing, and he realizes that, yeah, in some ways, time is on his side right now, and US public opinion doesn't want a war. Maybe he's able to just stay there. And it's really sort of a worst case scenario for those who want Maduro gone, because now they're sort of backing themselves into a corner where either you support a bigger military operation to remove him, or he gets a propaganda win because he's able to stand up. And because the Trump administration hasn't sort of thought through its plan for how they're going to push forward to remove him, and how this current chain of events does it. You can't just bomb drug boats to remove him. They're sort of stuck right now with what do they do next that can, to potentially get rid of him and not disrupt geopolitics, ruin their chances in the midterms, all of those things. I mean, it's a really complicated situation for both sides.
I'm curious to get your take on how this drama is playing out more widely in the region. How is, for example, Colombia, responding to all this, or Brazil or other key regional actors interpreting, what's happening between the US and Venezuela?
Yeah. So first off, Maduro is not well liked in the region. I mean, he's burned almost all of his allies at this point. So even his previous allies in Lula in Brazil and Gustavo Petro in Colombia were, previous Maduro allies who sort of got burned because he stole the 2024 election and refused to leave. And so people are kind of tired of him. If you look at the polling, Atlas polling via Bloomberg did a poll, and over half of Latin Americans would support the U.S. military intervention in Venezuela to remove Maduro, which is a shocking poll number and a bit controversial. And there's some questions about how the poll was done, and I'm not going to get into detail, but it does show like there's support around it. I mean,
yeah, like Maduro's got to be really bad if Latin Americans want American military intervention to topple him.
Like I said, there's questions about the poll, but there's some level of support for this operation across the region, which is amazing. And, people have stopped sticking up for Maduro, but the leaders of Latin America, Scheinbaum and Petro and Lula, don't want to see a U.S. intervention. And so they're trying to find a way in which they can help get this through a process to negotiate him out, either now or in the next year or two, that would be acceptable to the Trump administration, because a lot of the region does not want, Lula certainly doesn't like Maduro at this point, but does not want the U.S. coming in and kicking him out. That's a bad for South American sovereignty, right? But Trump does have his allies, and that includes, Trinidad and Tobago's prime minister has been strongly on the side of the United States, and it's cracking up CARICOM right now, the Caribbean community, because she is so adamantly in favor of what the Trump administration is doing. Trump administration has its allies in the region, and it is causing some divisions within the region. I think most of the region doesn't want to see a war, but they're also tired of Maduro, and they're happy to see some pressure. And so there are efforts right now to figure out, okay, what's the middle path? how do you get rid of Maduro without the United States coming in and bombing South America? And hopefully Scheinbaum and Lula and Petro are able to do something, but they haven't been. And that's one of the big efforts over the last decade. Everybody's failed. Efforts at sanctions have failed. Efforts at diplomacy have failed. Everything to remove Maduro has failed, from the most hawkish, most dovish policy. And so it's hard to say that anybody has exactly what the right answer is, because everybody's answer has been tried at some point over the last decade and has not succeeded.
I mean, even the Pope tried.
Yeah, to
Yeah.
go to Maria Corina Machado, right, who just won the Nobel Peace Prize, right? She attempted boycotts, she attempted protests, she attempted running in the election in 2024 and had stolen. Right now, she's attempting to via international pressure. They tried all these different routes, and it hasn't succeeded, which shows just how consolidated his dictatorship is, despite the economic and political weakness.
Before I let you go, is there any, question I didn't ask, any point you wanted to make?
I think the most important point, I know everybody wants to talk about Venezuela, but there's a bigger policy going on right now, right? The Trump administration really believes, the Trump administration broadly believes that they are at war with drug cartels in the Western Hemisphere. And yes, they've sort of shoehorned in Maduro and the TDA and the Cartel de los Soles into the drug war. But they're very interested in stopping fentanyl, which runs through Mexico. It has nothing to do with Venezuela. They're very interested in going after the Sinaloa cartel in Mexico. They want to go after the various cartels in Colombia that produce cocaine. This isn't over with Venezuela. Whatever happens in Venezuela in the next month or two, they're going to maintain a presence in the Caribbean with the Navy. They're going to continue bombing alleged drug boats no matter what happens, and they're going to continue going after cartels outside of Venezuela. And so this sort of strategy where everything's aligned at Venezuela right now exists, and I think it's really important. But it's also going to be important to watch what happens with Colombia, what happens with Mexico, what happens with Panama, what happens with Honduras. All of these things are going to matter to the administration. This isn't just Venezuela and they're done. They really are committed to sticking in this region and fighting. As illogical as the drug war is, they believe that they're at war with the drug cartels, and they really care.
Well, Boz, thank you so much for your time. And before I let you go, let me just plug your excellent Latin American risk report. I'm a paid subscriber. I encourage all of my viewers to check out Boz's work on Substack. And likewise, if you appreciated this conversation, if you're one of Boz's subscribers, check out Global Dispatches. We take a more global view of international affairs, but do frequently cover Latin America as well. Boz, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate the conversation. Looking forward to posting the video to my own Substack coming up. Appreciate it. Have a great afternoon.
All right.